Hello everybody, and welcome to the fifth lecture for the wolves and moose of Isle Royale. During this lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on how it is that the wolf and moose populations have fluctuated over time and explain that a little bit. Before we get going, though, I want to remind you of something that I'd said in the last lecture. I was a little bit unclear and perhaps misleading, and so last time when I showed this slide, I said that moose, or implied maybe that moose don't prefer birch or are unable to eat birch. And that's not true. Moose actually really quite prefer birch, like to eat it quite a lot. What I meant to say is that in the middle part of the island, the birch are of an age, they're fully adult trees with the leaves up in the canopy, that the leaves are out of reach for the moose to eat. So that's just a little point of clarification. Anyways, to the material for this lecture. First of all, with a purpose. The project has always had a purpose, and that purpose has been to explain how and why the wolf and moose populations fluctuate. And what I want to do is put that purpose into a certain context for us, a scientific context for us. I think many of you are familiar with this idea that life has several different hierarchical levels of organization, starting with cells and tissues and organs, and then all of our organs comprise an organism, and if you have several different organisms of the same kind living in the same place, they constitute a population. And if you have several populations of different species living in the same place, they represent a community, an ecological community. And then sometimes we say that if you take that ecological community and include with it the abiota, the non-biological parts of that community, then you have an ecosystem. It's these last four levels that are the interest of ecology. And I want to describe each of those four levels just a little bit because they'll provide this context for what we're going to do, especially in the next couple of lectures. The first level of interest for ecologists would be that of the organism. And there's a field of inquiry that's known as individual life history theory that focuses on the organism. It basically asks the questions, why are organisms the way they are? Why do they behave the way they do? Why do they reproduce at the rate that they do? Why do they live as long as they do? And so on. This includes, in addition to those types of topics, habitat relationships between an organism and the environment around it, and the foraging ecology of an organism. The next level up would be populations, and what corresponds to that is a field of inquiry known as population biology. This very simply is aiming to answer this question, how and why do populations fluctuate? And that is a large part of what the Isle Royale Wolf Moose Project is about, but not exclusively. We're going to, the Wolves and Moose of Isle Royale have something to teach us about each of these four levels, actually. And but population biology is a big part of it. Community ecology is especially interested in ecological interactions, especially between populations. Probably the most important would be competition and predation. So community ecology, of course, figures into the wolves and moose of Isle Royale, especially because of predation. Herbivory would be another one, parasitism another one, and so on. And then ecosystem science is a field of inquiry that is associated with ecosystems. This one is the most different from the other three. It has a tendency to focus on things like the flow of energy and materials through an ecosystem, and also, as I mentioned moments ago, interactions between the biotic and the abiotic components of an ecosystem. And so anyways, what we're going to talk about today is especially the population biology of the wolves and moose of Isle Royale. And that you can see that easily when we mention the purpose of the project, or what has for a long time been a purpose of the project. Now, the study on Isle Royale is the longest study of its kind. It's been going on for more than 5 decades now. And so what I want to do is I want to illustrate the duration of that study through a series of graphs. And on each of these graphs, what we'll see is time measured along the bottom for essentially the last 50 years. And what's over here on the left axis is the number of wolves. They go from 0 to 50, and they're going to be indicated by this red line. And I'm showing just the first 5 years of that. And I'm showing you just the first 5 years because most studies in ecology don't last even that long. And I want to kind of give a sense of what impact that might have. But first, to explain the rest of the graph. Then the moose are indicated over here on the right-hand side from 0 to 2,500, and they're indicated by this black line right here. And so, as I'd mentioned, most studies last for just 3 or fewer years in ecology. And when an ecologist is done watching a system for that period of time, they usually draw conclusions. Now, Durwood Allen and Dave Meach are the people who started working on this project, and after they had watched the wolves and moose for this period of time, they did what all good ecologists do. They drew some conclusions, and what they said, what they wrote actually, is that our studies thus far indicate that the moose and wolf populations of Isle Royale have struck a reasonably good balance. Now, this is the early 1960s, and what they were referring to is an idea known as the balance of nature. And the balance of nature was an important idea in the 1960s, and it's basically associated with a collection of ideas, really. And so here they are listed very roughly what these ideas are. It's that ecological systems are usually in some kind of a stable equilibrium, that whatever they're doing now is what they have a tendency to continue doing. There tend to be what are referred to as negative feedback loops. An important example would be predator-prey relationships. And the idea here is that if something gets a little too high, then that something else will kind of tend to bring it back. If something gets a little bit too low, then something else will tend to kind of want to bring it back as well. The other idea that's really associated with balance of nature is a little bit sometimes in the subtext or written between the lines or hidden between the lines. And that's that if this balance of nature is upset, it represents sometimes some kind of trouble for humans, because in so much as humans depend on ecosystems. And then there's this other rather normative or ethical claim that sometimes humans are associated with upsetting this balance of nature. This idea of balance of nature has a very long history. It goes back to the very earliest days of Western thought. A philosopher named Herodotus worked with this idea. It's important for mathematical biology. A very, very famous biologist, ecologist from working in the 1970s especially, his name is Robert May. He really worked with this idea of balance of nature a great deal. In diverse fields, like even the relationship between ecology and theology, a fellow named Desjardins worked with this idea of balance of nature and spoke especially of its theological overtones. And then a fellow named James Lovelock, who's important for something known as the Gaia hypothesis, which is important in a variety of ways. It represents a form of environmentalism, or is important for an important form of environmentalism. It's also an important ecological theory that was especially popular in the 1980s. Anyways, all of these ideas making reference to this notion of balance of nature. But to go back to the early 1960s when this first data was coming about, it was a nice idea, balance of nature, but there really wasn't a lot of good scientific evidence out in the real world to kind of tell us, yes, it's a good idea, the world really works that way, or no, it doesn't. And so what happened is in the early 1960s, the data from Isle Royale kind of figured kind of prominently into, well, maybe lending some credibility to that idea. Now, Durwood Allen, the fellow who started this project, he's a genuine pioneer in the field of wildlife ecology for at least two reasons. We'll talk about just the first reason right now. And the first reason is associated with a very simple idea, and his idea is this, basically, is that, well, if something different happens on Isle Royale, we won't know about it unless we continue to watch. And so it was his idea that we should continue watching what would happen on Isle Royale. And you have to understand, nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever decided, hey, we're going to watch someplace for a very long time. 5 years was considered a long time. And so it was with, maybe with a little bit of a jaundiced eye that people viewed Durwood Allen for like, well, okay, sure, go ahead, keep watching, whatever. We'd think you'd be bored by now or would want to study something else. But anyways, Durwood continued to watch. And what he saw in the years that followed is that the moose population began to grow quite a bit. And now what we have, up to 10 years in the study, is that the moose population has almost doubled in size. The wolf population is kind of bouncing around a little bit difficult to interpret exactly what's going on there. But at least from the moose's perspective, or for the moose part of things, you have to admit there's at least a major shift in that balance of nature, because there's now almost twice as many moose. The study had been designed to be a 10-year study. It was a collaboration with the National Park Service. It still is today. The National Park Service kind of thought it would be a good idea to wrap it all up and be done with it. And they rather encouraged the idea of just finishing the study. Again, here is where Durwood Allen's real value to the field of ecology lies, which he basically just ignored that advice and kept on watching. Actually, I should speak a little bit more here about his continuing to watch. You know, what we're already looking at here is 10 years worth of data. 10 years is a long time to do something, to make something a part of your life for that long. You know, it takes a bit of a commitment. And every year, you only get 2 data points, one for the wolves and one for the moose. So we're going to zing through 5 decades of history in really just about 40 minutes worth of time here. And but we have to appreciate this is happening very slowly, and it takes a great deal of patience to kind of watch it unfold at the rate that it actually did unfold. Anyways, what happened in the years that followed is that there were some severe winters, and with those severe winters there was an increase in the kill rates. With increase in kill rates, there was an increase in the wolf population. With there being more wolves and more predation, the moose population began to decline. And now we're all the way up to 22 years in the study. The moose population has just about tripled in size and then come down to about half of its maximum size. The wolf population is just at this point by the end of the 1970s has just soared. They're at an all-time high of 50 in the year 1980. If you had thought that there was a balance of nature before, you have to at least acknowledge there's been a major shift in that balance. Or you have to acknowledge, I'm sorry, I misspoke. You have to either admit that there is no longer a balance of nature, or you have to really redefine what it is that you mean by balance of nature. And so it's also at this point in the study, 22 years into the study, that now people are no longer saying, boy, are you sure you still want to keep watching the wolves and moose of Isle Royale? Haven't you learned as much as you're ever going to learn? People have stopped saying that by about this time. And instead, there are now questions for which the only way to get good answers to them is to keep watching. And one of the questions basically is associated with this. You know, moose have been on the decline for the better part of a decade. Wolves, of course, on the increase. Is it possible that wolves could drive their prey to extinction? Nobody knew. Nobody had taken a population of predator and prey, more or less trapped them on an island where they can't get away, and watched to see what would happen. Nobody had any idea at all. And so, of course, the only way to know is to keep watching. Well, what happened in the next year or two was really quite dramatic. And some of that drama can be illustrated through a series of territory maps. And so here is the year 1980. In 1980, there were 5 packs on Isle Royale. Each pack is indicated by the different colored polygon. The numbers represent the size of each pack associated with that pack territory. In 1980, there were 50 wolves on the island in 5 packs. 1 year later, in 1981, the packs are all discombobulated. There are 2 packs living on top of, basically in the same territory right here. 1 pack living almost entirely within the boundaries of another pack. 1 pack is just squeezed over here into the far northeast end of the island. A great deal of competition and stress going on because of all that territorial conflict, essentially. And what happens the next year is that 2 of the populations disappear entirely. 2 of the other populations are reduced to just a pair of wolves, and then really the only pack that has offspring with it and so on is this gang of 4, and they have the run of the island. Their territory spreads across the whole island. In addition to that territorial conflict and kind of territorial chaos, if you will, a lot of wolves died. They died of what seemed to be the usual causes, killing one another, starvation. But they died at really remarkably high rates, at rates that were a little bit, frankly, just unexpected. And what happened in just a 2-year period of time is that wolves went from their all-time high of 50 to what at the time was an all-time low of 14 wolves. Now, while many people expected the wolf population would decline, no one expected they would decline that dramatically. If food shortage is the explanation for a decline, it usually doesn't happen so catastrophically. Usually the decline is a little bit more gradual. And so one of the concerns is that there's something else besides food shortage going on here. I should also point out that in the year 1981, right in the middle of this crash, this is the year in which the Department of the Interior decided they would cancel the project. The Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Ray Arnett, this is under the Reagan administration, just decided that wolves and long-term research and studying wolves in a detailed way, that's just a bad thing. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and in a short while later, the project was reinstated. But it really is it's the second of several occasions to kind of scuttle the project, and it's a little difficult to understand. But there are good reasons why it is that long-term research is sometimes viewed as a threat, and we'll talk about that in a later class period. And so for now, the thing to appreciate is that the wolves have crashed. And it's not clear why. Shortly after this crash, we begin handling wolves for the very first time. At that time, in the mid-'80s, the reason to handle these wolves is especially to get blood samples to see if there are any diseases going on. And what's discovered is that canine parvovirus is found to have been affecting the population. Now, canine parvovirus is a really quite a remarkable disease. It evolved for the first time in the late 1970s. If you go back to, well, let's just say 1973 or 4, canine parvovirus didn't exist anywhere in the universe. It evolves probably from a closely related disease, a feline parvovirus. Upon being discovered in the late 1970s, it spreads throughout the world in 1 or 2 years' time, mostly being spread by domestic dog, but affecting other canids as well, in particular wolves, or at least as far as we're interested in, is wolves. This disease arrives to Isle Royale when a person brings a dog to the island. Now, it's not allowed to bring dogs to the island for exactly this reason, to the possibility of spreading disease. However, sometimes it's a difficult rule to enforce because a person can bring their own personal private boat to Isle Royale, and sometimes when they do that, they bring their dogs, and then it just happens. But here's kind of the most important thing about the whole thing is that this population crash is the most important event in the entire chronology of wolves and moose on Isle Royale. We've learned more from this human-caused perturbation than any other event or phenomenon on the island, and I'll say more about what it is that we learned from this perturbation in just a short while here. It'll probably come up in next lecture. The effects of this crash are still detectable 30 years later. Okay, even though the disease is gone, it caused the system to change in what seems to be so far this kind of irreversible way. And there's maybe a little bit, I don't know if it's ironic or tragic or maybe both, but what happens is that the most important event in the wolves and moose of Isle Royale was caused by humans, and this is occurring on a place, Isle Royale, which is a federally designated wilderness. Now, federally designated wilderness areas, they are the places in our country, in the United States, where we are most proud about and are most diligent about making sure that human impacts are not part of the scene, that they're kept to as minimal a level as possible. And so, among the lessons, there's probably two important lessons. One is that you can never be diligent enough if your interest is to minimize human impacts. And the other thing is that it may be an exercise in futility. And again, these are topics, this gets a little bit into the philosophy of wilderness. This is a topic we'll talk about in a later lecture when we deal with some of the philosophical implications of what we learned from the wolves and moose of Isle Royale. In any event, the wolves have crashed. They are at the lowest level observed up to that point in the chronology. And there's just questions now about what will happen next. Will they recover? And if so, will it take them a while to recover, or will they spring right back? With the wolves being so low now, will there be a chance for the moose to maybe rebound? Remember, they were at fairly low numbers at this point in time. And as you can well imagine, the only way to know the answers to these questions is to keep watching, and so we did. And so what happens next is that the wolves make what seemed to be a quick recovery, quick rebound, but it's short-lived, and then they drop out to lower numbers and spend the better part of a decade in the low teens. While this is happening, of course, the moose population is just soaring, just really going through the ceiling. It's in the year 1996 that moose are at their all-time high, almost 2,500 moose on Isle Royale. It's one of the highest densities of moose ever recorded on the planet. it's at this time, while the moose have grown to such high levels in the mid-1990s, that we permanently expand the focus of the study to not only be thinking about wolves and moose, but to also be thinking about the forest. And think about it for a minute. Wolves eat moose, and that's interesting. And we're trying to figure that out. Understand what it means and how it works. Okay, well, it seems like if that's interesting, well, then you might think that, well, that moose eating the forest, well, that might be related. Well, if moose are interacting with the wolves and if moose are interacting with the forest, you might need to know something about those forest interactions in order to figure out what's going on with the wolves. That it's connected in that way is not a huge mental leap. It's pretty easy to gather. But it took 37 years in the project's history to get to that level where you could start looking at that. Why does it take so long? It's not because nobody knew that it mattered or knew that it would. It's not because people didn't think it mattered or that it wasn't important. It's that when you're doing long-term research, you can't take such a big bite right away. You have to start small. Start with just wolves and moose. And in this case, it takes many decades to just do things like get the methods under control. And as the methods are under control and the data are rolling in, to just interpret and understand those things. And you know that other things matter, but you don't know what would be the most important thing to study next. And so you have to be careful and cautious, strategic about what next component of the ecosystem you would want to begin including. And so if Isle Royale is an example of something general, I think it is, it takes a long time to expand to include things that we know are important. This is one of the great values of long-term research. Now, the effect of moose on the forest, I'll say just a little bit about it now, and then we'll devote an entire lecture to it coming up. But for now, this picture says a great deal. On the left-hand side of this picture is a fence. And moose are unable to get into the area behind that fence. And on the right-hand side, there's no fence. The difference is pretty easy to see. On the left-hand side, there are all these conifer trees. These tall Christmas-type trees, if you like to think of them that way. And those trees are balsam fir trees. Those trees are about 35 years old. They're about 35 feet tall. And here's the important thing about it. What's on the outside here, these little sticks in the foreground, those are the same species of tree, balsam fir, and they're about the same age. And so this is an example of what it is that moose can do to the forest. They can really heavily impact a particular species of tree and make the forest become really quite altered, as indicated by the differences on the left and right-hand side of that image. And so I'd already mentioned that this is balsam fir. Balsam fir ends up being an important food item for moose in the wintertime. Well, balsam fir is an important species in a number of ways. It's not really very good food for moose. They only eat it in the wintertime. They only eat it when they have to, in other words. It's pretty poor quality diet, but they eat it because it's basically all that there is in the wintertime. This is a close-up picture showing what it is that moose do to balsam fir. They basically just clip off the ends of the branches, especially the vertical branch, the one that's wanting to grow up, the one that gives the tree height growth, is one of the twigs that they have a tendency to bite. They also have a tendency to bite off these other twigs that are up towards the top of the tree. Anyways, this is a tree that's been browsed just a few times. When a tree has been browsed repeatedly over its entire lifespan, and if we get a close-up look at it, this is what the tree looks like. And this tree on the right-hand side is about 3 or 4 feet tall from top to bottom, just to give you a sense of scale there. And that tree could easily be 30 or 40 years old. What we began doing in the 1990s is we realized that we hadn't been measuring balsam fir, this important food item for moose, for all these years, and so we don't know. Well, in order to understand how it is working in the system, you have to measure it. Well, 37 years had passed and we hadn't measured a thing. And so what we took advantage of is the fact that the growth of balsam fir is recorded for a very, very long time, of course, in the tree rings of in this case, balsam fir. And so this is what is referred to as a cookie, or just a slice from a balsam fir tree. These are the tree rings that are growing in here. And then what's in this lower image down here is a close-up of that, and we can see the tree rings growing like this. And what we look at, if we can look just at particular one, this is an example right here of a particularly large year of growth. This is an example of a particularly small growth year where the trees are going, where the tree rings are close together. The tree ring growth is an indication of how much foliage was grown that year. How much foliage is grown is an indication of how much moose food there was. And so what we're able to do is to take those tree rings, those periods of greater growth and lesser growth, figure out what year they took place in by studying those tree rings, counting backwards from a tree that was just freshly sacrificed. And then we can get an index, basically, or by doing this on many trees anyways, quite a number of balsam fir trees, what we can do is we can get a time series of growth for balsam fir, like what's shown in this graph here. And then what we can start to do is we can start to analyze the relationship between this index of food abundance and how well it is that the moose are doing. And in this way we can kind of study all at the same time, the wolves, the moose, and one of the major food items, balsam fir. The result of that analysis we'll talk about in quite a bit of detail coming up in a bit, but for now I just want to mention that it's just in the mid-90s that we begin doing that work. And so anyways, to return to the time series, remember moose have increased a great deal. But while the moose have increased for all that great deal, the wolves are at these very, very low numbers. And there's a number of questions about why they're at such low numbers, because it doesn't seem like food shortage would be a good explanation, because there's an awful lot of moose in the population. That would seem to mean an awful lot of food for the wolves. And so people were suggesting for the first time in the early 90s that maybe inbreeding depression is part of what's going on here. And it looks like there could be, at this time, or it seemed to be, a risk that the wolf population could go extinct because of this inbreeding. Well, what is this inbreeding all about? A couple of definitions and some technical terms, just so that we can have a precise understanding of these concepts. Inbreeding, rather specifically, is what happens when there is mating between close relatives, say between brother and sister, parent and offspring, maybe on some occasions cousins, first cousins, and that sort of thing. Inbreeding is more likely to occur when a population is small, because when the population is small, there aren't as many options for whom you can mate with, and the options available may be limited to close relatives. Another important thing about inbreeding is that inbreeding is generally associated with a loss of genetic diversity. Inbreeding depression is basically the bad stuff that happens to inbred individuals. And we understand this. We know that that's why among humans it's not a good idea for siblings or cousins and this sort of thing to mate. One of the things that's unknown is how sensitive most other species besides humans are to inbreeding depression, or how sensitive they are to inbreeding, I should say. We know that there's a lot of variation. Some species of animals are very sensitive to inbreeding, and they don't do well at all if they inbreed. Others are really pretty tolerant of it. They can handle quite a lot of inbreeding, and it's not a bother for them at all. Wolves are species that are probably somewhere in the middle. They can tolerate more inbreeding than humans can, for sure, but they still have some sensitivities to it. We know that wolves, when they have the choice, will avoid mating with their brothers and sisters and their parents and their offspring. First cousins, not so strongly avoided, though, for example, to give you a sense of things. And so anyways, it's just an idea, though. It's just an idea that maybe wolves are affected by inbreeding. There's no way to test it. We know that they're inbred because the population is so small. What we don't know is the low abundance that we see. Is it because of that? Anyways, what happens next in the history is the winter of 1995 and 1996. In particular, the January and February of 1996. This winter is the most severe winter on record in this part of the world, and throughout the upper Midwest it was a pretty severe winter. The winter came early. There was snow relatively early in the season. There was snow on Isle Royale also late into the season. Well into June there was still snow on Isle Royale. In addition to snow lasting for a long time, the snow was really quite deep. In addition to this really catastrophic winter occurring, this is happening at a time when moose had really depleted their supply of food. And coincidentally with that, there was an outbreak of ticks. This tick species is something that bothers the moose in particular. I'll tell you more about the ticks in just a little while. But for the moment, what's important is this convergence of this outbreak of ticks, the lack of food, and a severe winter all at the same time. And what happens is that the moose population crashes really catastrophically. In 1996 is the highest density of moose recorded on Isle Royale, one of the highest densities recorded anywhere in the world. The next year is one of the highest densities of moose carcasses. There were dead moose everywhere. To just give you an example, there's a trail on Isle Royale. It's a 7-mile length of trail that we hike frequently. And on that trail of 7 miles, there were 22 dead moose. In a normal year, there are no dead moose on that trail. You'd have to go many years for a moose to die right on the trail. But in that particular year, there were 22 moose that had died right on the trail. As soon as you had walked past one and stopped smelling it, you could smell the next one up above. It really, I should point out, this is an 80% population crash approximately to go from 50 wolves to 14. It's catastrophic because to go from 50 to 14 suggests that, well, you could go to 0 probably pretty quickly. Okay, this is also an approximately 80% decline. But in this case, there's still right here, there's still 500 moose on Isle Royale. That's a lot of moose. Moose are not in danger of extinction, but it's just a lot of death. An enormous number of moose. More than 2,000 moose died in just a few-year period. And so what happened next? Well, the moose start to make a recovery. It may not look like much of a recovery because it's kind of dwarfed by all this fluctuation right here. However, this increase, is from about 700 to about 1,100 moose. It's a pretty big increase. But then what happens next, and for the better part of a decade, is that the moose population just declines, gets cut by more than 50% over about an 8-year period. While the moose are going through that first rise and then decline, the wolf population is generally increasing, but it's really quite kind of a bouncy ride, going up and down quite a lot. Now, what's happening here? I should say, first of all, as this history of wolves and moose gets closer and closer to the present, it becomes a little bit difficult for us to understand what's happening. We seem to get a clearer sense of things when more time has passed. As things become more recent, our view is a little bit fuzzy, it seems. And so what I'm about to tell you is a bit speculative. We don't know if it's true, but it is the hypothesis that we're working with currently, and the one that we're going to kind of continue to test until we can kind of figure out if it seems reasonable or not. And here's what we think might be going on during this period of time, especially with respect to that decline in the moose. We think it might have something to do with these ticks. Now, this tick is a specialized organism. I have to confess, I can't remember if I've spoken about the ticks before or not. If I have, forgive me for just a short little bit of repetition, but if I haven't spoken about them yet, here we go. So this species of tick, it's called the winter tick. Sometimes it's called the moose tick. It's unusual in about 3 different ways. First of all, it specializes on members of the deer family. On Isle Royale, that means just moose. In other parts of the world, that can be white-tailed deer or elk or creatures like that. It's also a creature, this tick, that is only native to North America. Now, that it specializes on in the case of Isle Royale, just a single species, it seems unusual, but it's not, actually. There's about 400 or so species of ticks across the planet. Most of them are species-specific. It just turns out that the species of tick that we're most familiar with, like things like deer ticks and dog ticks, they are the unusual ones that will be happy to feed on anybody's blood. So it's just that we're familiar with the ones that are unusual. Okay, that's the first point of interesting feature of this tick, this specificity of the blood that it likes to eat. The second thing that's interesting about it is that it's active in the wintertime. Here's the life cycle of this tick in a nutshell. The tick exists only as eggs in the summertime, and those eggs are in the soil. At the end of the summer, they hatch, and then the tiny ticks crawl to the tops of grasses. This is be about mid to late October, and from the tops of those grasses, they just sit there and they wait for a moose to come along. And then when a moose comes along, they latch onto it, and then they live for the winter. They grow, they feed. The male and female ticks reproduce. The males die while right on the moose. The females continue on for a little while longer. Now it's becoming springtime. And then when spring has come, the ticks fall off of the moose, the females, with their eggs. They lay their eggs in the soil, then the females die, and then the cycle starts all over again. That's the second unusual part about this tick, is that they're active in the wintertime. And that's tough for moose because wintertime is is a tough time of year for moose, and then this tick just kind of adds to that difficulty. The last really remarkable thing about the tick is that one moose can have more than 50,000 ticks on it. And so this is a picture of a really heavily infested moose. It's a picture taken in the early springtime. This is when the damage done to the hair of the moose is at its greatest. And here what we can see here is, well, moose have black skin. So this area on the shoulder is basically bare naked moose. These blonde areas up and through here, these are broken or damaged hairs. And the only part of this moose that has kind of normal, healthy hair are these brown areas here on the belly and a little bit here on the cheek. Well, we began to think about 10 years ago, right around the year 2000, we began to think that, well, maybe these ticks have something to do with the relationship between wolves and moose. Well, all right, if that's true, the only way you can kind of assess that idea is to somehow monitor or count or index the abundance of ticks. Well, how in the world are you going to do that? I mentioned in the previous slideshow my wife, Leah Vucetic. She's also a full partner in the project, and she suggested about 10 years ago, why don't we carry with us in the field, when we're doing our field work, little notebooks. And on those notebooks, we have a little image of a moose. And when we see a moose, she said, let's just draw what it is that we see. So in other words, wherever there's bare hair, like right in here, we'll just draw that. And wherever the hair is damaged, like in here, we'll draw that that's the case. And so on. And so then what we can do is we can take these images, we can digitize them, and then use the hair loss, the amount of hair loss as an index of how many ticks there are on these moose. We'll look for as many moose as we possibly can in the spring, draw their images, and so on. Well, a few years later, digital cameras became more common, and we basically made that operation all digital, where basically in the springtime, what it is that we're doing is we're looking to find as many moose as we can, take their pictures, a nice profile like the image that we see here, and then we digitize those images and so on. Well, the result of having done this for the past 10 years is indicated by this graph. And so along the x-axis of the graph is time being measured. It's just for the past 10 years. And then what's over here on this axis is the percent hair loss. And so basically 0% hair loss, that's a happy moose, got no hair loss at all, no, presumably few or no ticks. 80% hair loss would be a nearly naked moose. What this dot right here indicates is that in the year 2001, the average moose had about 30 or 35% hair loss. In the year when we measured that, we didn't know whether it was that a high year or low year. When we measured it, quantified it, we're like, wow, that seems like a lot of ticks. Well, that was just the beginning, because for most of the next about 7 years, the number of ticks just generally went up and up and up and peaked in the year 2007. It wasn't until the year 2007 that finally the ticks started to decline. Well, let's think in particular about this period of increase, 2001 to 2007. That corresponds to this period that's indicated in pink right here, this period where the ticks are on the increase. Well, while the ticks are on the increase, we of course can see that the moose are on the decrease and the wolves are on the increase, notwithstanding this last little decline. I'll explain the decline in just a minute. But here's what we think is going on, is that with the ticks being more abundant, this weakens the moose, makes them not in as good a physical condition. When they're not in as good a physical condition, it gives an advantage to the wolves. And here is all we need for a situation where the wolves can increase, the moose can decline. Well, anyways, that's all fine, except for, from the wolf's perspective, too much of a good thing, and eventually there just aren't enough moose anymore to support those wolves, and then the wolves crash. And so we think that's what's been going on. Two questions, or two kind of comments. The first is that, like I said, we don't know for sure if this is what's the relationships of causality that are going on here or not. We have to continue to measure the ticks, continue to watch the patterns in relationship to what the wolves and moose are doing, and if those patterns continue to hold, then it'll seem like that's what's going on. At least for now, though, consider just the prospect. A creature the size of your pinky fingernail, a little tick, has the potential to have this profound impact on all of Isle Royale's ecosystem, because if this little tick can cause the moose population to be cut in half in terms of their abundance over about an 8-year period, Well, you know that that's, of course, having an effect on the moose. I'm sorry, on the wolves. And you also know it's having an effect on the forest as well. That one tiny little creature. What a really remarkable possibility. And then the other question that arises from these possible relationships is that, well, what causes tick abundance to fluctuate over time? We don't know. It's not a very well-studied creature. There's only a couple of people on the planet that study it. We're the only people that have some kind of long-term monitoring for this tick. Nevertheless, what we think may be the case is that climate warming may be something that favors this tick. Most aspects of the life history of this tick are favored by warmer weathers, including just the success of the eggs, all the way to things like this. When those ticks are on the grass in late October waiting to latch on to a moose, they will live until the first hard frost, and then they die. Well, if the climate warms and warms during the fall time, that means that those ticks will live for a longer and longer period of time on those grass tops, giving them more of a chance for a moose to come along, and then more moose getting infested with the ticks. There are other aspects too that are affected by climate with this tick, but this is enough to give you an idea. And so anyway, so that brings us up to right around here, about 2007, 2008. Well, what have we learned next? What we've learned next, and what has happened next, is not so much about the changes in wolves and moose immediately, but it's really what we learned in these last several years, especially the year 2009, 2010. It's what we've learned about stuff that had been going on all along, but just never knew. So first of all, I have to take a little bit of a digression and just kind of mention what it is that we had thought had been the case for these Isle Royale wolves. What we had thought is that they had been isolated from the mainland for basically the last 50 years. No exchange of wolves, especially in particular, no wolves coming to Isle Royale. We also knew they were inbred, and quite strongly so, but it seems as though they showed no signs of inbreeding depression. Remember, there was that period of low abundance for the wolves, but that's just circumstantial evidence. There was no real solid evidence that they were suffering from inbreeding depression. And so what happens is this, is that throughout the world, as we destroy habitat because of our human activities that we have, and then many populations become smaller and smaller, a number of populations of conservation concern, one of the conservation concerns, these various endangered and threatened species, one of the concerns is that they will suffer not only from just being small in size, their abundance, but they'll also suffer from a loss of genetic diversity brought on by high rates of inbreeding. It's thought that this would really make things worse. But what happens is that this is a difficult idea to assess. It's a difficult idea to know if it's really something to be concerned about. While almost all conservation geneticists are quite sure of this idea, many conservation biologists who are not so familiar with genetics, they're unsure of the idea. And so what they have done, what many of these scientists have done, is they have held up a few examples, Isle Royale being one of the most important, and they said, hey, this business about genetics, it's really not such a big deal. Look at Isle Royale. That population is very small, on average just a couple dozen individuals, and they've been going for a long time and don't seem to be showing any signs of inbreeding. What's the big deal? Okay, so Isle Royale had been this important example in this way. Well, no longer. Because here's what we learned in just the last couple of years. What we learned is that inbreeding depression had been present but had been gone undetected for many decades. And what I'm showing here in this image is the pelvis of a wolf. In addition to collecting moose bones, we also collect the bones of wolves. It's just that we never get as many of those, well, because there's not as many wolves. And when a wolf dies, their carcass decomposes rather quickly, and so it's hard to find these carcasses. Altogether, we have carcasses, or skeletal remains, I should say, from about 50 different wolves from the last 50 years. And what we're looking at here is the pelvis of a wolf, or the hip bone, if you like, and that's this bone right here. And then these are some of the vertebrae of the bone. And then this bone right in here, that's the sacrum. That's your lower back. When a person gets a little bit older and sometimes gets back pain in their lower back, it's often in the sacrum. It's right here, this lower part. Your sacrum is supposed to be symmetrical. What's on the left side is supposed to be the same as what's on the right side in terms of the shape. And I've outlined the back end of this sacrum with the red line there, and that shows pretty clearly that's not symmetrical. That's a pretty gross deformity. When we discovered this deformity, we shared it with a person named Janneke Rijken, and she's an expert in the anatomy of canids, in particular their skeletons, the anatomy of dogs and coyotes and wolves and these kinds of creatures. She's from Sweden. We sent her images of this, and when she saw this, she said, well, if you have that problem, I'm sure that your other skeletons have other troubles that you just never noticed. And so we said, oh my. So what we did is we photographed every vertebrae from every one of the skeletal remains of all of the wolves that we had. Each vertebrae got photographed in all of its different angles. And we sent all of these photographs, these digital images, off to Janneke Rijken, and she looked at them. And long story short, here's what we found. Oh, I should actually point out, before I tell you what we found with all of those skeletal remains, is that this deformity, the deformed sacrum, it has a special name. It's called a lumbral sacral transitional vertebrae. It's got a special name because it occurs with some reasonable frequency in some breeds of domestic dogs. So it's a reasonably well-studied phenomenon. And what we know is that when dogs get this deformity, especially something as severe as what's like illustrated here in this picture, they often, not always now, but they often suffer from nerve damage because the nerves are basically kind of twisted and kinked and pinched as they have to go pass through those bones. That nerve damage can cause difficulties in the ability of those wolves to move their legs, difficulty with respect to continence, their ability to kind of control their ability to defecate. They have trouble controlling their tail, which is for a social animal that uses its tail to communicate with other animals. That can be a big deal. Anyway, so it can be a bit of an issue to have this deformity. And what we know, because it's a well-studied deformity, is that in most normal wolf populations, the incidence of a deformity like this, one of these vertebral deformities, is about 1 in 100. But on Isle Royale, 1 out of every 3 wolves has had this kind of deformity. It's always been there. It's always been going on for decades. We just never knew it. And so we were pretty wrong about saying that wolves weren't suffering from inbreeding depression. They were. The other thing we learned during this period, and this is just the last couple of years now, comes from collecting DNA from the scats that wolves deposit. So what we do is when, in the wintertime, when we go to a kill site to perform a necropsy, we collect all that wolf scats. I'd mentioned this in a previous lecture. And we do that so we can get basically what amounts to a DNA fingerprint. And from that, we can tell the different wolves apart, one individual from another. We can tell males from females. We can tell how these wolves are related to one another, brother and sister. And here's the most important thing. We can tell whether a wolf actually came from Isle Royale or not. Because the wolves on the mainland have a sufficiently different genetic signature that we can tell them apart. And so what we discovered just last year, in the year 2010, is something that occurred about 13 years ago. And that is what happened is in the year 1997, a wolf immigrated from Canada to Isle Royale. And so here we have it. We learned a couple of things. The population is not quite as isolated as we once thought it had been, and it also has been, at the very same time, suffering from significant levels of inbreeding depression. Well, so how did this wolf come to Isle Royale? He came to Isle Royale from an ice bridge that formed. These ice bridges used to form every year, 50 years ago when the project started, used to form every year. And basically what we're talking about, and this is a map of the western part of Lake Superior, this is Isle Royale, this is the south shore of Lake Superior right here, and then this is the rest of the shoreline up in here. All the rest of the white that you see is ice that's forming. Big ice flows. Well, what you can see is that sometimes the ice flows form between Canada and Isle Royale. In the beginning part of the study, like I said about 50 years ago, those bridges, ice bridges, would form every year, and they would stay for many, many weeks, well over a month. What's happened recently is that they hardly form at all with climate warming, basically. Now, there are some winters when there's no ice bridge at all. And for most winters, an ice bridge forms, but just for a few days of the year, maybe, or at most maybe a week. And then what happens is basically the wind blows it out, because the ice never gets a chance to get very thick, because it's not as cold as it used to be. Anyway, so that's how this wolf got to Isle Royale. Now, the impact of this wolf is really quite dramatic, and the best way to get a sense of the impact of this wolf is to look at a map of Isle Royale that has the territories that had been present for the time when this immigrant wolf was alive. Actually, you know what? I want to back up a little bit. I want to back up to this picture. I want to say a little bit more about this immigrant wolf. Here's the thing about this wolf is that in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, we knew about the identity of this immigrant wolf. I should have said this right when I first showed the slide. The immigrant wolf is this one right here in the middle. Okay? We knew about his identity all along, all the time that he was alive. We just never knew his heritage. We just never knew where he came from. We presumed he was an Isle Royale wolf. Okay, well, why did we know his identity, though? Well, because he was a pretty spectacular wolf. First of all, as he grew older, he turned rather light in color. And while in some wolf populations that's relatively common, an Isle Royale has never been seen before. He was the first wolf to ever kind of turn rather light in color, and you can see that from this image here. He's also a big wolf. You can see that in the image as well. And so we could recognize this wolf from one year to the next by his large size and his light color. We called him the old gray guy because he was there year after year. He lived for quite a long time. He was also really quite a successful and aggressive wolf. He led Middle Pack during some of the best years that Middle Pack ever had. Under his leadership, Middle Pack grew to its largest pack size ever. One of the largest pack sizes ever seen on Isle Royale. He was also really aggressive territorially. Really was just a thorn in the side of his neighbors, especially Chippewa Harbor Pack after they had formed and become developed. And so he was an impressive wolf. To get more of an idea of how impressive he is, let's look at this map of Isle Royale. Remind ourselves that he comes to Isle Royale in the year 1997. He becomes the alpha male of Middle Pack in 1998. Okay. His son becomes the founder of Chippewa Harbor Pack in the year 2000. If you remember, in a previous lecture, I described a rather long story about how a wolf had been beaten up in the waters of Lake Superior and another wolf was on the shoreline, a male wolf, kind of a straggler wolf from Middle Pack, and kind of nursed the wounds of this female. We're talking about the same wolf here, the son of this immigrant. That's the same wolf. Okay, well, what happens a couple of years later, right here, in the year 2002, is that the immigrant's daughter becomes the alpha female of Middle Pack. The alpha male and his daughter begin mating. Wolves generally avoid doing that, but what probably is being indicated here by this behavior is that basically the immigrant is, now these are not necessarily conscious thoughts, but they're certainly associated with hormones, and they're certainly real phenomena. From this immigrant wolf's perspective, all of the wolves around him, all these Isle Royale wolves, are so inbred and so inferior in terms of their fitness because of that having been inbred, that it's better for this immigrant wolf to mate with his own daughter than it is for these, if you like the term, the riffraff that he has around him. And so he does, and mates with his daughter in that way. Okay, what happens next? 2003, a son and a daughter of the immigrant become the alpha wolves of East Pack. What happens next is that another son and daughter of this immigrant become the founders of Paducah Pack in 2007. And so here we are in about a 10-year time frame. We have these 4 packs. And remember, if there are 4 packs in a population, that means there are only 8 wolves breeding in the population because there's only 2 wolves breeding in each pack. So Isle Royale has 8 breeding wolves during this period of time. 7 of the 8 breeding wolves are the immigrants or one of his immediate descendants. And so what happens is that this wolf represents what we now have described as a genomic sweep. He's just more or less taken over the population. We'll talk about some of the implications of that in a little while in a different lecture where we focus on genetics. But for now, we can say a few things. He was an alpha wolf for 8 years. That's a pretty long time to be an alpha wolf. He gave birth to 34 offspring. He has 22 grand offspring, and they are still being born. And 56% of all of the genes on Isle Royale that are there today, of the wolves that are there today, 56% of those genes are descended from this one wolf. And so this is the era of the old gray guy. This portion of the time series that's highlighted shows the time when he was alive. And it was a pretty, pretty remarkable set of findings to have during those years. Well, to bring us up right to the very, very present, up to the year, basically up to January 2011, the most recent time that we counted these wolves and moose, here's what we have. The moose population is kind of basically staying at relatively low numbers, and then the wolf population has more or less been declining. Now, the decline that we see in these last several years is more dramatic, actually, than even what the time series here represents. Let me show you what's been happening for these last couple of years, and again, through a series of maps. In February 2009, there's 4 packs on Isle Royale. May of 2009, just a few months later, one of those packs goes extinct, the green pack, Paducah pack. About 8 months later, roughly, February of 2010, another pack goes extinct. That's East Pack. We're down to 2 packs from 4 in just a couple of years. Really in just 1 year. Now I need a little bit of space. February 2011, the most recent time that we counted the wolves, and 1 year after this last most recent map. Finally, middle pack goes extinct. We have just 1 pack on Isle Royale now. There are 50, at most, probably actually only 14 wolves, though when I made the slide, we thought there were 15. They're just in 1 pack. And so not all of the wolves are in the 1 pack. Chippewa Harbor pack has basically 9 wolves. The other 6 or so wolves are the loose remaining remnants of middle pack. They're just kind of running around loose in a non-territorial manner down at the west end of Isle Royale. In addition to having fewer than 15 wolves in 1 pack, which again, to have wolves in just 1 pack, that hasn't happened on Isle Royale for more than 4 decades. We also now have, at most, 2 adult females. The sex ratio is very, very skewed. And one of the great concerns is that those 2 females, if they die before giving birth to more pups, it could be trouble. And as you know, wolves don't live very long. They typically only live for about 4 years. And this summer, these lectures are being recorded in the summer of 2011. This summer, we've failed to detect any reproduction by Chippewa Harbor pack, which makes us wonder, did they have any pups? And if there aren't any pups, that means there aren't any new females. And this is just allowing for more and more time for those females that are there to die. So it's a pretty precarious situation. And we'll just have to wait and see how it all plays out. And so that's where we are today. That's the now more than 50 years of watching wolves and moose on Isle Royale. And we can ask ourselves, okay, what does it all mean? In the biggest picture sort of sense, what does it all mean? And what I'd like to do is outline what I think are basically 4 lessons of what it all might mean. And actually, before we get into those lessons, I'd like to take just a short little break, and then we'll come back and pick it up just momentarily. Okay, so what I want to do now is go through what I think are 4 useful overall lessons to get out of having studied the time series of wolves and moose in the way that we just did. The first lesson is an easy one, and it's that the most important events in ecology are basically unpredictable. Think about what we saw on Isle Royale, these severe winters, the introduction of disease, and the outbreaks of ticks. These are the most important events that occur on Isle Royale. They're all basically unpredictable. It's pretty straightforward and kind of simple. To get into the second lesson, what I want to do is we'll just follow a train of logic. And so first of all, for 50 years, the purpose of the project has been to try to understand and predict what's going to happen next with respect to the wolves and moose on Isle Royale. Now, in that effort, what we learned is that the accuracy of our predictions, our ability to be able to tell what's going to happen next, are comparable to those of long-term weather forecasts and long-term forecasts for financial markets. And we know that we're not very good at either of those. And our ability to predict what happens next in ecological systems seems to be just the same. Other ways to wrap our minds around this, basically the same idea, is that every 5-year period in this Isle Royale chronology seems to be different than all the other 5-year periods that we've observed, and that's still happening even today after 50 years. The first 25 years of the study seem to have been different than the second 25 years of the study, especially marked by the crash of that wolf population with the disease. And so there's every reason to think that even the next 50 years are going to be different than the first 50 years. So it's always different. That pattern hasn't changed after 50 years. We're still seeing that. And so what happens is that the more we study, the more we realize how poor our understanding really is. Remember, go back to the very, very beginning. In those first few years, what did we say was going on? We said, oh, well, it seems like there's a balance of nature. Well, after having watched the whole thing, you realize, wow, nothing could have been further from the truth. That's a very poor description of what's going on. And then remember, for many, many decades, I had said that what we thought is that the wolf and moose population was completely isolated, didn't show any signs of inbreeding, and then we realized, oh, we had been completely wrong about that as well. And so again, it's not just that we're adding information as we watch for longer. That's true, we are adding information, but we're also giving like wholesale revisions to our explanations for what has been going on as we watch longer. And so this leads us to our second general lesson, and that is, it seems to be that in ecology, we have a tendency basically to explain the past, not so much to predict the future. Certainly on Isle Royale, that's exactly what we do. We don't predict the future. We're basically unable to do so. We explain the past. And this has two implications. The first implication is scientific. The second one has to do with management. First, the scientific implication. And it's basically to ask a very age-old and long-standing question in ecology, which is to ask, are ecological systems governed more by law-like principles like those that govern physical systems, like in physics and in chemistry, or are ecological systems governed more by historical contingencies, things that just happen that can't be predicted, and when they happen, they kind of change the course of everything that happens next. Okay, so it's basically asking, is ecology more like physics, or is ecology more like history? This is one of the oldest questions in ecology, and Isle Royale is a great, magnificent example of, one, how difficult it is to answer that question, but two, how it is that it seems like, there's a strong dose of both of those going on at the same time. Well, here's what's important about this possibility, is that if ecology is more like physics, more like a science, then science works and offers explanations by making predictions. But I just said we can't do that. Okay, well, history works differently. History offers explanations by interpreting the past. That's exactly what we do. And so what happens is the possibility of Isle Royale kind of compelling us to ask this question, what is the purpose of ecological science? Is it different from other sciences? And if so, how and what does that mean? We'll unpack the implications of this question in a little bit more detail in a subsequent lecture. But for now, we'll just leave it like this. To illustrate this idea about how things are changing over time, I should say it this way, how our views are changing over time, we can look at this time series, and the time series just represents the history of the project going from left to right. In the first years of the project, it was viewed as being just this simple system between wolves and moose. It's not that it was a simple system involving just wolves and moose. That's how it was treated, because that's the best that could be done for those 10 years. And then what happens for about the next 20 years is this appreciation that it's not only wolves and moose, but also winter climate is pretty important for affecting the moose directly and for affecting predation. And so the system didn't change, just our understanding and perspective of it changed. And then what happens, for about the next 15 or 10 years or so, is this appreciation that not only is it wolves, moose, and climate, but also balsam fir and the forest vegetation are an important part of it. They'd always been important. It's just now we're starting to realize, oh, that's a big part of it too. You can't understand it without that. And then now we realize that, wow, it's not only winter climate, fur, wolves, moose, and those creatures, but also ticks and summer climate. We're just starting to learn, is also, I wouldn't talk about that so much, but starting to learn that's also an important part of the whole thing. Genetics as well, we can add that to the list. It had always been there, but our view of it, our perception of it changes, even though the system is not changing in those ways. They've always been important. So that's the second lesson. We don't predict the future, we explain the past. It has a second implication about management, and it's basically this, is that natural resource management, how it is that we relate to nature, whether it be through agriculture or through forestry or through the management of wild animal populations, that management typically is founded on believing that we have an adequate understanding of nature and that we can predict the consequences of our actions. Remember, it's about understanding and prediction. And remember, that's what the purpose of the project had been, to understand and predict. And what we realize is that we're not very good at that. And so what happens is that Isle Royale represents this paradox. And the paradox is that on the one hand, we can be proud for all of the science it is that we've learned, but at the very, very same time to be humble about how little it is that we understand. And this is not a lesson just about Isle Royale. In this case, Isle Royale becomes a metaphor for how it is that we understand and can relate to nature in general. The lesson is a need for more humility about how it is that we interact with nature. We interact with it believing as though we understand it all and can kind of predict the consequences of our action, even though sometimes we pay lip service to the contrary. We don't really act that way. And but Isle Royale pretty clearly shows that it doesn't work that way. The third lesson is that predation is an important component of ecosystem health. If we take the total sum of all that we've learned about wolves and moose on Isle Royale, that whole 5-decade-long time series, one of the big lessons that comes out of it is that predation is a healthy part predation is an important part of a healthy ecosystem. I want to unpack this idea just a little bit. Durward Allen is the fellow who started the project, and he began the project, remember, in the late 50s. This is one of the darkest hours for wolves in North America. And when he began the project, he had a purpose in mind, and his purpose was to understand wolf-moose dynamics. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Nothing surprising there. But he had an end. He had a grander purpose. And the grander purpose he wasn't ashamed of. He was pretty straightforward about it. And that was to dispel myths that we have that cause us to hate wolves. And so what Durward Allen did is that he knew there was a relationship between our ethical attitudes and scientific knowledge. And now today, it's more common to pretend like those things are like water and oil. Ethics and science. They don't mix. They shouldn't be brought together. They should be kept separated. It's dishonest, inappropriate to be mixing them. This is what we have a tendency to kind of think about today. But really think of it. The greatest heroes we have in 20th century ecology and conservation are people who knew that that was not the truth. People who knew that ethics and science, they are connected, and the wisest thing to do is to recognize those connections and to do science that is consistent with good ethical attitudes, and to let your ethical attitudes be informed by good science and so on, to appreciate that there's a connection there. Okay, what does this have to do with predation being an important part of a healthy ecosystem? Here's how it's connected. We can ask this question: what is a healthy ecosystem? What does that mean? Consider this sentence. This is a healthy ecosystem. Is it a scientific claim? Or is it a subjective value judgment? And I think what's happening here is that when we say today, in the beginning of the 21st century, that predation is an important component of healthy ecosystems, this is basically what's happening. It's this. People like Durward Allen, they start this project about wolves and moose on the island, on Isle Royale. Project is continued by people like me today. What do? I study predation. I obsess over it. I think about it day and night. I study it from a population dynamics perspective. I study it from a behavioral perspective. Study it from its ecosystem consequences. Study it from all these different angles is all that I do. And then what do I do with all that information? Well, I share it. I share it with people like you. I share it with members of the general public. I get excited about it. And then what happens is it's not that I declare that predators are an important part of healthy ecosystems and that's it, it's done. No, it's not that. It's basically I share my appreciation for it all, describe its intricacies and its details, and then you all decide, wow, that's important. We should probably have that in our ecosystems. In the places where we've taken away, we probably should put it back. That's what ecosystem health is. Ecosystem health is the result of an interaction between good scientific knowledge and wise ethical attitudes. Durwood Allen understood that. And so the third lesson is this business about healthy ecosystems and predation. But the third lesson kind of leads into a fourth lesson, and it's this question: what's the purpose of ecological knowledge? And I want to state things kind of starkly, and in doing so, it might be a bit artificial, but it's intended to make the point clear. Let's consider two choices for what the purpose of ecological knowledge might be. Is it to inspire and to motivate our interest to control nature, to just manage it, in some cases managing it just for the sake of managing it? Or is the purpose of ecological knowledge to inspire a sense of wonder, to inspire the kind of wonder that's necessary for making us say, hey, I care about this place and I want to take good care of it? In either case, it's associated with understanding that there's a relationship between ethics on the top and science on the bottom, and it's different sciences and different kinds of ethics. If you have an ethic that's obsessed with controlling nature, then the purpose of knowledge is going to basically be to help you better control nature, and those two ideas are going to feed back off of one another, and it will basically become a fetish. And there are more than one conservation biologist that think that that's a good description of what we have today. The other view is to say that, well, if we have an ethic that's obsessed with respecting and caring for nature, well, then the purpose of knowledge would be to generate a sense of wonder about nature and ability to care for it, and then those two ideas will feed back off of one another. And so I think what we can have is that the four lessons that come out of looking at that very long time series are basically these. And no need to read them because we've just been speaking about them. But the last one, the one that I haven't stated yet, is that what we need is a science that better understands its relationship to environmental ethics. I think Isle Royale is a pretty good example of showing how that can be highlighted rather than hidden, these relationships, and used to the mutual advantage of both nature and our own welfare. And so anyways, what I've just described is something that might be described as a historical narrative of the time series of Wolves and Moose and Isle Royale. And that's where we're going to stop for today. What we're going to talk about next time is we're going to talk just a little bit about Isle Royale itself, the island, the physical place. It's where it all happens. And there's a little bit of important biogeography that's really kind of key to why the project is the way that it is and why it's yielded so much information. And we'll talk about that next class period. So until then, thank you so much for your attention, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye now.